Welcome back to my channel, Simplified English 101. If you are new to this channel, please remember, like this video, leave a comment. Do not forget to subscribe to my channel and ring that good old notification bell so that you can be informed when a new video is posted. In today's video, we are going to be discussing the short story To Daughter in Memoriam by Paule Marshall. We are going to be discussing the author's technique, the themes and the devices that we see in the short story. If you missed my previous videos, where we discussed the characters and characterization, as well as the setting in the short story, feel free to check that out. I will also leave a link in the description box below for you to be able to quickly identify that. Now, as promised, let us begin. The narrative elements or the author's technique or techniques within this short story. 1, the form in which the story is written, which is the autobiographical nature of the story. 2, the narrative voice, which is used by the author in the way the story is presented. The setting as a technique used by the author, characterization, and also the devices used by the author. Let us look at the first element used by the author, the autobiographical nature of the story. Based on the definition I have, it says an autobiographical narrative. These are stories people remember about events in their life. Some writers refer to memories of important personal events, and they retell these to us. Most autobiographical stories have and should have: 1, they are written in the first person narrative. 2, they are told from the voice of a child, and oftentimes we get to see the transition into their adult life. Sometimes we are presented with only a version of the truth, but the author cannot always describe the events objectively or factually, as some of these events are based on memory from childhood rather than from recent events within their life. Oftentimes, it calls for self-evaluation or introspection. They want to see what you did wrong in the past and, you paying penance for it by the time you get into your adult years. And this is what we saw within the story of To Daughter. It also depends on how the author arranges the events of the story. So we get to see what is truly important to them, thus the thematic concerns presented, especially in this story. It is usually written in chronological order, and it shows the author's development over time. Usually, it is allegorical, meaning the story and the characters and the place and the events that we see that is delivered to us, it usually have a broader message about the real world and issues in the world, or rather, it's a simple story that represents a larger point about society, human nature, human existence. And within the story, we see that there is a larger message to it. And as such, it is seen as an allegory. Also, characters are usually well developed and true to life, and we can see this in how Daughter and the narrator are both presented. We also see the use of personal pronouns in autobiographical stories. We see the use of the pronouns I, me, my, we, and our, and we do see them in this short story. We also see the use of the flashback technique used in autobiographical stories, and we see it in this particular one. Now, when we look at this story, To Daughter in Memoriam by Paule Marshall, we see these features throughout, and it makes it a good autobiographical piece. The author used this narrative form to not only retell the stories, but also as a good way of introducing us to the characters, the conflicts that exist, the creation of the events from start to finish, as well as highlight how the themes come to life. So this particular story or narrative form is crucial within this story. So we can say, therefore, that the autobiographical nature of the story is crucial in the presentation of the events, the thematic concerns, and the characters that we meet. Let us move on into another narrative technique used by the author. The narrative voice. Now, this is important. You can, of course, follow along with the pointers I've given, and of course, I will give you more explanations on these. Now, the events of the story, they are written and they are told in the first person child narrative voice for the better part or the better half of the story. Through the eyes of a 9-year-old unnamed girl, we get to see the interactions of the characters. We get to see her first meeting with her grandmother on the island she considers strange. We get to see her crossing the geographical boundaries in that time period as she traveled from Brooklyn, New York to Barbados. We also get to see what the setting was like through her voice. We get to see not only her crossing the geographical boundaries, but we also get to see her crossing other boundaries as her relationship with her grandmother developed and the lessons she learned that she carried into her adult years. Now we're at the third point. As a first-person child narrator, when we met her, she doesn't think or feel much about anything. Rather, she spills the bean, if we want to call it that. And she tells us what she feels, what she sees, how it appears to her eyes, no matter how distorted it looks. For example, when she meets her grandmother, Dada, for the very first time, she says she sees a small, purposeful, painfully erect figure and a face that was as stark and fleshless as a death mask after maggots has done their work. Now, this image that she paints to us, the readers, it could be exaggerated, it could be grossly exaggerated to be that, especially coming from a child and coming from a child who saw the place Barbados as alien and the things within it also as being alien. As a result, whether the grandmother truly looked that way, we don't know, because from a child narrative voice, we only get their version of the truth as seen from their eyes. So everything looks strange to her, of course, because she's not from the island. She is a child. So we're going to get that distorted, strange image. And this is what we saw when she presented her grandmother. She also shares her first experience of the different sounds and smells and sight of the island. Now, it's natural for a child who visits somewhere for the first time and who has nothing to compare it to think of it as being alien, the sight and the sound and the smell, of course, as being strange. In this story, this was the case, and all that she shares to us comes from her memory. Now, later in the story, we get to see that the title of the story, In Memoriam, is truly the child recanting her childhood experiences of her life or visit in Barbados with her grandmother. Also, through her eyes, the conflict is developed. The clash that exists between the old, which is her grandmother, and the new, which is herself. The clash between the settings, the urban area of New York and the rural area of Barbados, among other things, or other clashes or conflicts. The narrative voice is important, therefore, because we get to see the events of the story from the child's perspective and those involved in the events, while experiencing what the child experiences. So the moment she experiences it, we experience it. So the first person narrative voice is quite important. From her point of view or her voice, the story appears credible. Of course, because of the autobiographical nature, again, it makes the story appear credible. Because it is also first-person narrative, it also, again, makes it credible. It also makes it personal, and it creates a sense of identity to the characters, as well as makes the story appear intriguing. However, we are not always given the truth with stories told from children, stories told from the first person voice narrative. Now, some of these events can appear one-sided because, of course, all of them are coming from me and what I see and how I see it through my eyes, whether it's true or not. Now, this one-sidedness is now makes our observation skewed. It is skewed based on how we feel about the characters, whether good or bad. The narrator can be also seen as unreliable in that some of the information presented, of course, because of the autobiographical nature, it is given based on memory. Now, this memory is all the way from when she was a child. So clearly, many years have passed. Now she is an adult. And when we think about memory, we think about it changing over time based on experiences, persons involved in her life, based on her settings, interactions with people, etc. Now, this change results in a twist in the meaning or the accuracy of the story told. Therefore, it is left up to us to determine whether we want to believe what is told to us or not. So, we just looked at the pros and the cons of the narrative voice. Now, let us move on into another technique used by the author, which is the setting. Now, I am not going to discuss the setting at length because I did do a video on the setting previously, and again, I am going to leave a link to that for you in the description below. Now, the setting is important as a narrative element in the story. The events of the story, again, it is set in Barbados in 1937. We are introduced to St. Andrew, which is found in Barbados, and this is where Dada's relatives live. We are also introduced to St. Thomas, which is where Dada lives. We are introduced to Bridgetown, which is where the narrator meets her grandmother for the very first time, and it is also the major town in Barbados. So we're introduced to different settings in the island of, or on the island of Barbados. We see that Barbados is contrasted a lot with New York by both characters, thus making it easier for us as the readers to visualize and experience with them. We see the contrast in the rural areas of Barbados that has many trees, fruits, and others. We see the natural beauty of the island. We see the bright sunlight, the bright colors, the sugarcane, to show how they communicate, of course, and how they socialize with the different characters that they interact with. As a result, the ruralness in the grandmother is seen in her language and in her pronunciation of words. For example, there are many instances in the novel, but for example, the one that comes to mind right away is when she says, "I didn't think so." You know, when she was talking about, you know, what you have in New York to what I have in Barbados. And there are, of course, many other examples. The setting also helps to make it clearer and easier for us to identify the characters and where they are from, thus their exposure, their interaction, etc. Additionally, the setting of the Panama money that was mentioned by the grandmother brings the story kind of to a full circle, thus making the events appear real and making the relationship feel a lot more realistic. Now, the setting, finally, it brings out the views of the characters within the story. For example, we get to see the stereotypical views of Dada about America in New York, specifically persons in Brooklyn, in comparison to Barbados. She refers to them as foolish people. When she speaks to her granddaughter, she also says, "You must be one of those New York terrors you hear so much about." She's clearly suggesting that New York, America, is seen as a dreadful, scary, and violent place in comparison to Barbados, which she believes is peaceful and beautiful and lively and bright and welcoming. While the narrator views Barbados as, even the town of Barbados, which is quite busy, as negative. She sees it as a funeral. She sees it as sad, like a grave, and she sees it as mournful in comparison to New York, where she's familiar with, that she sees as colorful and lively and ever-changing. I want you to please note that though there are so many differences between the two, that their tone or their attitude is quite similar. And when we look at the contrast in the story, we will of course see this. Now let us look at another aspect that is used, or technique that is used in the story to help present the events to us. The use of devices. Now, there are many devices used in the story, and I am going to mention just a few. We see the use of contrast from the very beginning to the end, the use of imagery, symbolism, illusion, flashback, imagery, metaphor, and simile. And of course, I point out that there are many other devices used, some more used more often than others. Let us look at contrast and how it is used as a narrative technique or device. Now, contrast is important in this particular story because it helps us to see the differences that exist between the characters, the differences in their world and culture, the differences in the setting, the differences in what is seen as modern versus what is seen as traditional, and all the while doing so, the author is showing a connection between the two. And this is why I pointed out earlier that although there are so many differences between the two, they have similarities between them, and one of them is the tone. Let us now look in depth at, of course, contrast. Now, between the two characters, we see that Dada is the oldest, the narrator is the youngest. One is from America, the urban world, the city world. One is from the rural area, which is Barbados. One is a big city girl and one is a little city woman. One is a daughter and the other is a mother and granddaughter. Now, the contrast that we first see when we read, it describes her grandmother's attire and appearance. When she meets her, she says, as an old-fashioned white dress, and this is what the grandmother was wearing, while brought the sense of the past that was still alive in the bustling present. Additionally, Dada is described as a woman with an intense, unrelenting struggle between her back, which was beginning to bend ever so slightly under the weight of her 80-odd years and the rest of her. She also described her as ruined skin, years of work and stuff, and deep wells of temples and jaw, and the eyes that were alive unnervingly, so for an old woman. However, or on the other hand, the narrator is described as young. When she visits her grandmother, she is described as a 9-year-old child with a fierce look that the grandmother recognizes. So, of course, right there we see a lot of contrast between the two characters. Now, there is a level of irony presented in the contrast that we see between both the old, the new, the rural, the urban, Barbados, and New York, the settings, urban tradition, modern tradition, personalities between the two characters, the physical description or appearance of the two characters, even the symbols that we see, we do see contrast in them, and the language used by both characters, we do see contrast in them. Now, there is a level of irony presented in the story or the overall story in that the characters, they are so different. There's so many differences between them. However, they spend so much time together once they meet. Remember, they are socially different. There is financial difference between them. There is cultural difference. There is geographical difference. There is physical difference, personality-wise and age-wise. Yet they appear to be connected from the moment they meet. We could therefore assume that the author is exploring the theme of connection, that the characters are able to forge, this kind of bond despite their differences. The narrator stated that You know, her grandmother recognized her small strength, and this was all she ever asked for. So the moment they met, though they realized that there's so many differences, they did realize that there was a similarity. This shows the beginning of the connection between the two, which later helps them to create an emotional connection. Contrast is also seen in the setting. You can check out my previous video on where I discussed everything about the setting. Throughout the story, the contrast between the setting and the cultural difference can be seen. As the two who appear foreign to each other compare their homes and they try to find out which is better, which place is better, which is more superior. We also see the contrast between the palm tree and the Empire State Building. Let us now move on to imagery. We are not going to discuss much, just to point out that imagery is seen in the character description, imagery is seen in the description of the setting, imagery is seen in the presentation between life and death, and imagery is also seen between the two characters when they finally become anchors for each other during their moment of fear. Let us look at symbolism. We are going to discuss 4 symbols within the story. There are others that you could look at, but these are the 4 that we will explore today. First one, rural and the urban world. Now we look at the rural people who continue to follow tradition, like Dada. She continues to follow tradition and they refuse to change, or they are afraid of change or what change might bring. They also appear to be not very important when you compare them to the changing world and the rural and the urban areas like America. While the urban world, which is America and other places, they represent the modern world, which has financial stability because of, industrialization and them ever changing. We also look at the palm tree and the Empire State Building. We see that the palm tree, it stands tall, just like Dada, with its flaunting dark crown in the blinding white light of the late sun. The palm tree, it symbolizes our African heritage, and it is also economically important wherever it is planted, in that it has created many products, or many products can be created from it. So any country that basically has a palm tree can make money from it. It also stands for peace in this small island and victory, and it also could symbolize Dada's resilience in the idea that she was bending because of age, but she was determined to stand tall despite the aches and pains that she was feeling. So it also could symbolize her resilience and her pride. Now, the Empire State Building, it symbolizes progress, power, and growth. It also symbolizes industrialization. And when we think about the Empire State Building, we think about steel and a lot of steel and iron. And just like the plane, the Empire State Building, the mention of it, we could suggest that it also contributed to Dada's death because she feared change, and the Empire State Building, it represented change and the growth, and she feared that. She feared the modern world, and the mention of that we could say contributed to her death. The sugar cane represents remnants of slavery and colonization. It highlights Britain's influence on the island. Now, when we think about the sugar cane, it also has a connection, or it connects Dada to her past, her history, and of course, the exploitations of Africans on the island. The sugar cane, which she so proudly describes, it also helps to create fear in the narrator. One could say that Dada loves it, the narrator fears it. We could say that this contrast kind of mimics life, in the sense that what appears beautiful to one person is the opposite for the other. And it could also suggest that, wherever life exists, then death also exists or will follow. It is ironic also that the sugarcane that Dada loves so much is deeply connected to slavery, pain, death, broken families within the Black culture or race. Yet Dada remains so proud of it and speaks so highly of it. We could imply that this is because of Dada's lack of knowledge of course, her own history and heritage in its entirety. So we're not saying that she doesn't know anything about her history, but we're saying that, you know, what the sugarcane really symbolizes for the Black race, she, you know, is a little bit ignorant to that. It is for this reason that she possibly speaks so proudly of it, and she only focuses on what the sugarcane is able to do for Barbados as a country and how others depend on what Barbados has to offer, although they are small. And she is not connecting it to the past, the deep rooted history where colonization, murder, death, exploitation of the Black race is connected. The planes that Barbados sent in the 1930s, specifically 1937 during the riot, and I'm not going to discuss this because, again, I mentioned this in my video on the settings at length, so you can check that out. The plane symbolizes one, how modernized other places are in comparison to Barbados. Two, it could represent colonial oppression that the island encountered for many years. It could also, three, symbolize Britain's control over their colonies, that they could just fly over, drive fear into the people, basically keep them in check, even 100 years after slavery. And finally, it represents the death of Dada, because of course the plane represents technology, industrialization, change, machine, and these are all the things that she feared. Finally, we are going to just briefly mention some of the themes that are presented in the story, and there is a possibility I might just do a video on this. So if you want me to, remember to subscribe to my channel, like this video, leave a comment, and let me know if you would want me to do a video analyzing the themes in the short story. Some of the themes presented are childhood experiences, clash of culture, and of course the setting, race and the stereotypical views, love and family relationships. We also see themes like conflict between the characters, change and or acceptance, attitudes to the past, fear and anxiety, influence of the environment. Now, not all these are major themes, but they are themes nonetheless. Now, this has taken us to the end of my video for today. Please remember to like this video if you have not yet done so. This will help me out. Remember to leave a comment. Let me know what videos you'd like to be done. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Subscribe, 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 and subscribe. I'm going to repeat it until you do. And finally, ring that notification bell. So once I post new videos, which I always will, you will be notified. Until then, bye.